Our first chapter is cost classification. So, what is meant by the word cost? Now, cost is basically the amount that has to be paid to acquire something. So, if you want to get something, you have to pay certain price for it. So, that thing, that price, that amount will be cost for you. Let's say, for example, you go to a bookshop and you purchase some book and you paid some price for that book. So that price that you paid to purchase that book is cost for you. Similarly, if you buy some services, then you have to pay for that services. Okay, the services that you are getting, you have to pay for it. So that will be your cost. Okay. Now you had an internet connection in your house. Now to get that internet connection, you have to pay some service charges at the start, and then you will be paying the monthly bills. So that service charges at start and monthly bills, it's a cost for you. So amount that you have to pay to get something is the cost for you. The second definition that you need to be familiar of is of cost object. Now, what is cost object? Anything for which separate measure of cost is undertaken. So anything for which management is trying to calculate the cost, or anything for which management is compiling the cost, is known as your cost object. Let's say you want to find out the cost of a single product. So that product will be your cost object. Let's say you are trying to find out the cost of a service. So that service will be a cost object for you. For example, you are trying to find out the cost of departments of a company. So that department will be your cost object. Similarly, if you are trying to identify what is the cost of a customer, what are the costs that you are bearing in relation to the customers, then the customer is also the cost object for you. So anything for which management is trying to compile the cost, or for which management is trying to calculate the cost, that thing is known as cost object. The next definition is cost center. Now, what is cost center? A cost center is a production or service location, function, activity, or item of equipment for which cost can be ascertained. A cost center can be any physical location, it can be a function or activity, it can be any equipment for which you can compile, or for which you can separately identify the cost. Okay, so that is known as cost center. Now, what is difference between these two, cost object and cost center? The first thing is, the cost object is anything for which management wants to calculate the cost. That is cost object. A cost center is anything for which you can identify the cost separately. Okay, so they both are the difference between these two is this. But a cost center can also be a cost object. Let's say, as I said, a production or service location, cost center can be any physical location for which you can identify the cost. Let's say there is a production department in a company, and you can identify that these costs are related to that production department. Okay, so it will be known as your cost center. Now, if management is trying to find out the cost of that department, the production department, it can also be a cost object. So that is the difference. Anything for which management wants to find out the cost, that is cost object. And anything for which you can separately identify the cost, that is known as cost center. So a cost center can be a cost object. Now, further examples of cost center are, like I told you about, the physical location, let's say a department of the company for which you can, separately identify or trace the cost. Then it can be any function or activity. Let's say you are a construction company and you have the surveying function. So if you can identify that, that these costs are related to that service function, so that service function will also be your cost center. Okay. Let's say a company's work is, there's a construction company and they are doing different projects. Okay, now if you can identify, that these costs are related to the project, or if you can separately compile the cost for that project, so that project will be known as your cost center. Or even if it is an equipment, let's say a machine in a factory, a plant in a factory, And for that plant or machine, if you can identify that, these costs are related to that machine, then that machine will also be known as your cost center. Okay. So it's very simple. A cost object is anything for which managements want to calculate the cost. While the cost center is anything, it can be a physical location, function or activity, or an equipment for which you can trace the cost separately. Okay, so that is cost center. The third definition, it's cost units. Like, for measuring everything, you need some units. Let's say for measuring distance, you need units like kilometers, miles, meters. For measuring weight, you need like pounds, kilograms, grams. You need different units. Okay. For measuring height, you use feet and inches. Similarly, for measuring cost, you use some units, and those units are known as cost units. Okay. Let's say you have a hotel. Now, you need to identify what's the cost unit for a hotel. So a room, hotel room can be a cost unit. What is the cost per room? So a room, you can take a room as a cost unit. If you have an institution, if you have a school and college, you can take a student as your cost unit. What is the cost per student? You can take a teacher as a cost unit. What is the cost per teacher? Okay. You can take a certain subject as a cost unit. What is the cost per this subject or this course? Okay. What is the cost per diploma? So there can be different cost units amongst the organization. If you are a paint manufacturer, a cost per liter of paint, so a per liter of paint can be your cost unit. So cost unit means the units that are using that the units that you are using to measure the cost, they will be known as cost unit. Remember one thing, a cost unit does not mean the cost of one unit. No, cost unit are the units that you use to measure the cost. Okay, so it's different. Okay, remember that. Now, the name of chapter is cost classification. Now we have gone through the different definitions. Now let's discuss about the classification of the cost. Cost can be classified on different bases. There are different ways. There are different criterias that are used for classifying the cost. So in this chapter, we will be discussing four different bases, four different ways uh, of cost classification. The first one is classification by element. By element, cost is of three types: material cost, labor cost, and expense. Then there is classification by nature. By nature, cost is of two types: direct cost or indirect cost. Then there is classification by function. By function, cost is of two types: production cost and non-production cost. Then there is a classification by behavior, and by behavior, cost is of four types: fixed cost, variable cost, step fixed cost, and semi-variable cost. So we will be talking about these all classification bases in this chapter. Now let's discuss them one by one. So the first one is classification by element. By element, cost is of three types: material cost, labor cost, and expense. Now, what is the material cost? All costs that you incur in purchasing material for production or non-production activities. So basically, the cost that you are incurring to purchase the materials, it will be known as your material cost. For example, you purchase some raw materials, the cost of that raw materials will be known as material cost. For example, you purchase some components, the cost of those components will be known as your material cost. For example, you have purchased some parts, the cost of that parts will be known as material cost. The second is labor cost. All the staff that is working in your organization, all the employees of your organizations, okay, they the cost that you are bearing in relation to them will be known as labor cost. Okay, so all the cost that you are bearing with respect to your employees, in relation to your employees, it will be known as labor cost. For example, you are paying salary to your employees, so salary for you is a labor cost. For example, you are paying some bonus to your employees, so bonus is the labor cost. For example, you are paying some sick pay to your employees, so sick pay will be your labor cost. For example, you are paying for the training of your employees, so the training cost will be labor cost. So all the cost that you are bearing for your employees, for your staff, it will be known as your labor cost. The third one is expenses. Now, usually in our day-to-day life, we use the word cost and expenses interchangeably, but in cost accounting, they both means the different thing. Okay. Now, expenses are those costs which you cannot classify in the material or labor. So any cost that does not fit into the category of material or labor, it will be by default, it will be automatically known as expenses. For example, rent. Now, rent cost, you cannot say that rent cost is a material cost. You cannot say that rent cost is a labor cost. You cannot classify the rent in the material or labor. So by default, automatically it will be known as expenses. Similarly, the telephone bills, heating bills, electricity bills, insurance, power cost, all these are expenses because you cannot classify these in the material or labor. So any cost which cannot be classified in the material or labor is by default your expenses. Now moving on to the next criteria or basis of classification, classification by nature. By nature, cost is of two types, direct cost and indirect cost. Direct cost is a cost which can be directly identified, traced, attributed, related to the cost unit or a cost center. It is known as direct cost. So, making things simpler for you, if a cost can be directly traced in a finished unit, in a finished product, you'll say that this cost is a direct cost. Direct costs are further direct costs are of further three types. The first one is direct material cost. So what is direct material cost? Uh, Material cost that is identify directly identifiable in finished product. So what does that mean? Now let me give you an example. Now let's say you go to a shopping mall and you see a shirt. Okay, the shirt is a product, is a finished unit. Now what is the shirt made up of? It is made up of cloth, right? Now, when you will see the shirt, you can directly identify that, this is made up of cloth. Simple. So a cloth is what? Cloth is a material. And because you can directly identify this material, so the cost of this material will be your direct material cost. Another example that I can give is like, let's say, wooden chair. There's a wooden chair that is in your house. Now, what is this chair made up of? It is made up of wood, right? Now, wood is a material, and because you can directly identify, you can tell by saying, by seeing the chair, you can see that that this is made up of wood. So this material, the wood that is a material, is directly identifiable. So cost of that wood, cost of that material will be your direct material cost. Similarly, there's a plastic chair. It is made up of plastic. Plastic is a direct material, and the cost of that plastic is your direct material cost. So material that are identifiable, that are directly identifiable in the finished unit or product, that material is a direct material, and cost of that material is a direct material cost. Then comes the direct labor cost. Specific cost of labor that is directly involved in production. So labor that is directly involved in production, the cost of that labor is your direct labor cost. Okay. I gave you an example of shirt. Now, who made the shirt? The shirt is made by the tailor, right? So tailor makes the shirt. Now, tailor is what? Tailor is a labor. And because he is directly involved in the production, so it means the tailor is a direct labor. So the cost of that tailor will be known as your direct labor cost. Now, what is the cost of tailor? You will be paying some wages, some salaries to the tailor. Okay, so that cost will be known as direct labor cost. So the cost of direct labor is known as direct labor cost. What is direct labor? Direct labor is the worker that is directly involved in production. Okay, and remember one thing: production or provision of service. So if a person, wait a second. So if you are a manufacturing organization, then you will say the person that is directly involved in production, he will be known as direct labor. If you are a service organization, then the person that is directly providing the service, he will be known as your direct labor. Okay, let's say you go to an audit firm. Okay, you go to an audit firm. Now, who is responsible for doing audit? The auditors team, right? The team of auditors. Now, auditors in an audit firm, they will be your direct labor, and cost of that direct labor will be your direct labor cost. Okay. So if you are a manufacturing organization, then the person that are responsible for production, they will be your direct labor, and cost of them will be your direct labor cost. And if you are an audit firm, those who are responsible for providing the audit, they are the team of auditors, they will be your direct labor, and cost of them will be your direct labor cost. Similarly, the wooden chair, it is made up by carpenter. Carpenter is directly involved in production. So the cost of that carpenter is your direct labor cost. The next thing is direct expenses. Okay. So first thing you have to identify, that this is an expense. Then you will see whether it is direct or not. Now, what is direct expense? Any expense which is incurred specifically for the product or job. So any expense that is incurred just for a specific reason, just for a specific reason, just for a specific single reason, that expense will be known as your direct expense. For example, you hire tools. Okay, you hire some tools to perform a job. Okay, job, let's say the name of job is job 123. You are an electrician, and you got a job of doing some electricity work in someone's house. And for doing that job, you need to have some tools. You don't have those tools, so you go to the market and you hire some tools. Okay, hiring means like leasing. You lease some tools, you hire some tools, you pay for them, you pay for the tools for using them for certain days. Okay, now this hire of tools, this hiring cost, you cannot say that this hiring cost is a material, nor you can say it is a labor. So by default it will be your expense. Okay, and because you have incurred this expense only for this job, so this expense will be known as your direct expense. Okay, if you are to be using these tools in different jobs, like 5 6 different jobs, then this will not be a direct expense. Okay, direct expense is the one that you are incurring specifically for a single reason. Okay, so this is your direct expense. Other example of direct expense can be royalties. Okay, now what is a royalty? Royalty basically means that if you are copying the design of someone, you have to pay him some charges for using that design or for copying that design. Let's say you copied uh, uh, a design of a shirt. Okay, a design of a shirt. Now you have to pay the original designer some charges for copying his design. So that is known as royalty. So royalty will also be your direct expense. Okay. So these are some example of direct expense. Sum of all direct cost is known as prime cost. Direct material plus direct labor plus direct expenses, they are known as prime cost. Now the second cost by nature, it's is indirect cost. So by nature there were two costs: direct cost that we already discussed about. Now indirect cost, it is exactly the opposite of direct cost. Direct cost was directly identifiable, traceable, attributable, relatable. The indirect cost is not directly identifiable, traceable, attributable to finished unit or finished product. There are three types of indirect cost. Number one is indirect material. Okay, now what is indirect material cost? Material cost which can't be traced on a product. So if you cannot trace, can't be traced on a product directly. Okay, directly. Now any material that you cannot directly trace in a finished unit or a product, it will be known as your indirect material. Okay, I gave you an example of the shirt. Okay, now the shirt, it is made up of the shirt, it is made by the sewing machine, right? The tailors made the shirt using the sewing machine or any machine. Okay, now for cleaning of that sewing machine, you purchase some cleaning oil or fluids. Okay, cleaning oil or fluids, you purchase some cleaning oil or fluids so that you could clean the sewing machine so it could work smoothly and efficiently. Now this cleaning oil and fluid, the oil and fluid, they are what? They are material, and you cannot directly trace them on finish unit. You go to a supermarket, you go to a shopping mall, and you see a shirt. You cannot directly identify, by seeing the shirt for the making of this shirt, a cleaning oil must have been used. You don't know that. You cannot directly identify that. Though that cost was part of a production process, but it's not directly identifiable. So such a material which is not directly identifiable in finished unit, the cost of that material will be known as your indirect material cost. Now, usually the example of indirect material cost will be the cleaning oil, fluid, lubricants. Okay, this is what the examiner will ask you. Okay, the indirect material cost example is simply the cleaning materials. Okay, because the rest of the materials they are used in the production process, so except for them, all will be indirect material, and the cost of them will be indirect material cost. Second is indirect labor cost. Now, the direct labor were the persons that were directly involved in production or provision of the service. Now, what's the indirect labor? Indirect labor are the workers that provide assistance to direct labor or direct workers. So those are known as indirect labor. Okay. So to make things simpler, you can just say all of the labor except the direct labor, they are indirect labor. Simple. Okay. Now, what is the example of indirect labor? I told you, I give you an example of shirt. Now, shirt is made up of made by tailors in a factory. Now, usually there will be a person, a supervisor or manager that will be overlooking the tailors. Now, supervisor, he's what? He's a labor. Is he doing production? No, he's not doing production, so he's not direct labor. He's just supervising the tailors, the direct workers. So he's not doing the production, but he's assisting them, right? So that person will be known as your indirect labor. Okay, so a person that is not involved directly in the production or provision of the service, he is your indirect labor, and cost of that person will be known as your indirect labor cost. Like you will be paying some salary, wages to the supervisor, so that will be your indirect labor cost. Okay, there are many examples of indirect labor, like the clerks, the accountants, the security guard. They are all indirect labor. So simply all the persons, all the workers that are not involved in the production or provision of the services, they are known as your indirect labor. The third definition is indirect expense. Expenses which can't be directly charged to production. So direct expense was an expense which was specific to a purpose. Indirect expense is a general expense, general or overall expense. It's not specific expense. Okay. Like the example of indirect expense can be rent. It's of a complete factory, rent of a factory. Power is an indirect expense. Insurance is an indirect expense. Depreciation is an indirect expense. So such the expenses that are general in nature, they are known as indirect expense. I gave you an example of hire of tools. Hire of tools. Hire of tools. Now, if you hire the tools for doing different jobs, let's say job 1, job 2, job 3, job 4. So you have hired the tools for performing different jobs. Now, this is not your direct expense because it's not related to a specific job, right? You are not incurring that expense for a specific reason. You are incurring the expense for doing different things, different jobs. So now the hire of tools will be indirect expense. So in this way, you have to differentiate between direct expense and indirect expense. Now, the sum of all direct cost was known as prime cost. Sum of all indirect cost, it is known as overheads. So that was it for the classification by nature. The third classification basis is classification by function. By function, the costs are of two types: production cost and non-production cost. Now, what's the production cost? Cost that relates to the manufacturing of product or provision of service is known as your production cost. These are part of cost of sales in statement of profit or loss. So basically, production cost are all the costs that are incurred in a production process as a whole. They will be known as your production cost. Now, usually the examiner or the in the questions, you will see the word factory cost. No, factory cost means production cost, because factory is a place where the production is done. So if the word factory is used, you can have an assumption that it means that this is a place where production is done. Okay, so factory cost is also known as production cost. So if any cost that is related to a factory, you can say that that cost will be a production cost. Now, What are the examples of the production cost? The first one, prime cost, or all the direct cost. All the direct costs, they are the production cost. It's obvious because they are directly identifiable. So it means that they are incurred in the production, right? So the prime cost, it's the production cost plus production overheads. All those indirect costs that are not related to the production, they will be known as your production cost as well. Okay, they are known as production overheads, and they will also be your production cost. Okay, now let me give you some an example of production overheads. Okay, so we just talk about the cleaning oil or fluid. We just talk about it that it is an indirect material. Now it is indirect material. Yes, it is indirect material, and indirect costs are known as what? They are known as overheads. So if a cost is indirect, it means it's a part of overheads. It's an overhead cost. And whether this cost is a part of production process, you have to ask yourself, yes, it's not directly identifiable by seeing the finished unit, but it is the part of production process, right? So it will be a production cost. Okay, so it will be a production overheads that are related to production. The second example I just gave you is was of supervisor salary. Okay, let's say now supervisor is an indirect labor, and if he is an indirect labor, he the cost of the salary or the salary is an overhead. Okay, now supervisor, he is not involved in production directly, but he is assisting the production workers. He's supervising them, he's managing them. Okay, so supervisor is also the part of production process. He's not doing the production, but he is the part of production process as a whole. So he will also be known as, so the cost of supervisor will also be known as production overhead. Okay. Now there's one another interesting example, that is the factory security guard salary. Factory security guard salary. Now it's an indirect labor, right? The factory security guard, he's not involved in production, so he will be indirect labor. So if anything is indirect labor, it means it is an overhead. And now we have to see whether it is production overhead or not. Now the thing is, most of you, you will be saying, this is not, he's not part of production process, so this is non-production cost. But no, the security guard is a factory security guard. He is assisting the factory workers. How? By providing security to them. So he is the part of production process as a whole. So the cost of the factory security guard will also be known as production overhead. So he is also part of the production process as a whole. Okay, remember that. The second thing, the second classification by function is non-production cost. So costs that are not associated with the production as a whole, the production process as a whole, they are known as non-production cost. They are charged as an expense in statement of profit or loss. It means you directly deduct them from statement of profit or loss. While the production cost, you include them into the cost of sales. Now, what are the examples of the production non-production cost? The first one is admin cost, administration cost, all the costs that is related to office. Now, the factory, it's outside the city, while the main offices are usually in the city. The main offices are the place from where administration is done. Okay, so the cost of that office, they will be known as your administration cost, and administration cost is a non-production cost. For example, the rent of office, for example, the salaries of the office personnel, for example, the heating and lighting bills that you will be paying for office. So all the costs that are in relation to office, they will be known as your admin cost, and admin costs are non-production cost. Then comes the selling cost. Selling cost is basically all the costs that are related to boosting the sales. Okay, that are relating to the sales process, they will be known as selling cost. Like advertisement and marketing, it can come under the selling cost. You're advertising for the product, so you could boost sales. You are marketing for the product, so you could boost sales. So they can also come under selling cost. The sales manager's salary is the selling cost. If you are manufacturing the cars, you must have some showroom in the city side, different showrooms in the city. You will be paying rent of those showrooms. You will be paying the person that are working in showroom some salaries. You will be paying the heating bill, lighting bill, all of those bills. Okay, so All of those will be your selling cost, and selling cost is a non-production cost. Then comes the distribution cost, all the costs that are related to distribution process. What does the distribution process means? Distributing the finished unit to the customer. All the costs that are in relation to this process, they are distribution costs. For example, you have a warehouse in which the finished products are stored. The customer orders some product, you bring the product to the customer from those warehouse. So all this process is known as distribution process. Now what are the distribution costs? The cost of warehouse, rent of warehouse, the person that are that are working in warehouse, salaries of those person, the bills of the warehouse, then the salary of the delivery driver who is responsible for delivering the goods, delivering the products. Okay, if your delivery truck is on rent, then the rent of that delivery truck, it can also be a distribution cost, and distribution cost is a non-production cost. Then comes the finance cost. Finance costs are all the costs that are related to the financing of an organization. So basically, a very simple example is you took out some loan for your organization, and against that loan, you are paying some interest. So that interest cost is known as your finance cost, and finance cost is a non-production cost. So that was non-production cost. Now, I told you just that the factory security guard salary is a production overhead. Now, what if I ask you, tell me what will be the salary of an office security guard? Will it be a production cost or a non-production cost? So it will be a non-production cost. Why? Because he is the security guard of office. Okay, and so his cost will come under the administration cost. So it will be a non-production cost. So in this way, you have to differentiate between the things. Now let's discuss an example of the production overheads. Okay, now there are some costs that are listed down here, and you have to tell which of these costs are production overheads. Now let's start. So hockey skill manufacturers, hockey skill manufactures hockey sticks. Okay, so there's an organization who is manufacturing, who's producing the hockey skills. A summary of some cost headings include the some costs that are related to this process. They are listed down. You have to tell which of the following costs are the production overhead. Okay, so production overhead means the indirect cost which relates to production. So you have to identify two things. Number one, the cost should be indirect or overhead, because indirect costs are part of overheads. They means overheads that are related to production. Okay, so first I will do what? I will first classify whether the thing is material, labor, or expense. Then I will classify whether it is direct or indirect. Then I will see whether it is a production or non-production. So cost that is indirect and that relates to the production will be our answer. Now let's start. Wood used as a raw material. So wood, it will be a material. Will it be a direct material? Yes. By seeing the hockey, you can see that it's made up of wood. It's directly identifiable. So it's a direct material. And is it a production cost? Yes, the direct cost, they are production cost. So this will not be our answer because we have to identify indirect cost that relates to the production. Then come the rubber covers for handles. So covers that are on hockey, they are material. Yes, directly identifiable. You can clearly see them, and it is a production cost. Depreciation. Now, what's the depreciation? Now, those who have done the financial accounting, they know that depreciation means it's an imaginary expense. Uh, and depreciation is basically what? When you use some asset after consuming that asset, or whether when you are consuming that asset, the value of asset, it falls. Falls by what amount? Falls by an imaginary amount that is known as depreciation. Okay, so depreciation is an imaginary expense. So depreciation will be an expense. Okay, it is an indirect expense. You have to remember that depreciation is an indirect expense, and it is a production cost. Why is it production cost? Because depreciation is of machine that is used in manufacturing the hockey sticks. That is used in manufacturing the hockey sticks. So it's a production cost because that machine is being used for the production, and depreciation is related to that. So it will be a indirect cost that is related to production. So it will be a production overhead. So this will be our answer. Okay. Now let me clarify you more about depreciation. Those who have done financial accounting, they know. Now let's say you let's say you have machine which is being used for manufacturing hockey. Now the cost of machine was $1,000. Now, when you use some asset, when you use some machine, when you will be using machine, it will, the cost of the machine or the usage of the machine, it will wear out by the time, right? When you purchase an asset, when it's new, it works perfectly. But after using it, its value falls. So the imaginary fall, that is known as depreciation expense. Okay. Let's say you are saying that, after 1 year, my value of the machine will fall by $100. So it will be worth 900 now. So this imaginary fall that you are assuming, that is known as depreciation. Okay. Depreciation. The next cost is a power. Power is an expense because you cannot classify it in either material or labor. So it is your expense. It is an indirect expense. Okay, a general expense. It's an indirect expense. And yes, power is related to production. So this will be a production overhead. Then sales manager's salary is a person's salary. So it's a labor cost. And it is an indirect labor because the sales manager is not involved in doing production, so it's indirect labor. It is a non-production because sales manager's salary is a selling cost, and selling cost is non-production cost, so it will not be our answer because we have to identify the indirect costs that are related to production. Then comes labor in assembly department. So labor cost, it's a labor cost, it's a direct labor. How do you know that? Because in factory, in assembly and finishing department, you do the manufacturing. Okay, you do the production. So it's a production cost. Oil and greases, oil, it's a material, right? It's an indirect material because you cannot identify by seeing the hockey sticks, that there was a oil and grease cost associated with it, right? You cannot directly identify that, but it was a part of production process. How? Because oil and greases, they are used to clean the machinery that is involved in production. Okay, so it's an indirect material cost and it is related to the production. So this will also be our production overhead. Telephone and postage, it's an expense. It's an indirect expense, and it's a non-production cost because it's an administration cost, and administration cost is a non-production cost. Then comes the insurance. It's an expense, indirect expense, and yes, it's a production cost because it's the insurance of the plant is the machinery that is involved in production. Then supervisory labor. Supervisor is a labor and he is an indirect labor. Yes, he's indirect labor and he is the part of production process, so yes, it's a production cost. So this will also be our answer, I and J, because they are indirect cost and they are related to production. All the indirect costs that are related to production are known as your production overheads.